Hello there. I'm Charlotte Forrester, one of the John Brown volunteers, and I will be reading to you Caleb T. Maupin's Kamala Harris and the Future of America. Kamala Harris and the Future of America by Caleb Maupin. Chapter 1. Where did Kamala Harris come from? The decision came late. August 1st had been the date when the vice presidential nominee of Joe Biden was to be announced. But the decision was not made until August 11th. Amid the confusion and anticipation, something was happening behind closed doors. The U.S. public got to know Kamala Harris through the months of delayed decision as she appeared on almost every mainstream talk show, giggling, talking about her childhood, reflecting on her experiences with racism, and her hobbies such as cooking. Politico hinted that Kamala Harris would be the nominee in what appeared to be a leak, but the Biden campaign made it clear that the decision had not yet been made. Kamala had seemed to be the obvious choice when Biden announced his pick would be a woman of color, but yet, new names suddenly appeared in the running, as if some desperate resistance to picking her was coming from various quarters within the Biden camp. In the week prior to the delayed announcement, the media had suddenly begun highlighting former UN Ambassador Susan Rice as an alternative to Harris. Suddenly, the relatively unknown Los Angeles Congresswoman Karen Bass was filling headlines as well. Almost as soon as Karen Bass's name hit the national media, she was subjected to an all-out red-baiting campaign by the press. Mainstream newspapers like the Washington Post and the New York Times were pointing out that this potential vice presidential nominee had visited Cuba with the Vencermo Brigade during the 1970s and praised Fidel Castro. Much like months before with Bernie Sanders, these oddly worded press articles framed Bass as cozy with Washington's political opponents and thus unfit for office. The schedule for the Democratic National Convention speakers, released just hours before the announcement of the VP pick, listed Kamala Harris as speaking in a separate time slot from the vice presidential pick. This was almost declaring she would not be selected. Harris was reported to have unfollowed Joe Biden on Twitter just a few hours before the announcement was made as well. When the news finally came that Kamala Harris had been selected, many were perplexed. She had seemed like the obvious pick months ago. Why the delays? Why the last-minute scrambling? Why the incorrect Democratic National Convention schedule? Why had Karen Bass been raised from obscurity only to be roundly condemned as a communist sympathizer? It is clear some negotiations had taken place. Last-minute deals were made. Joe Biden's arm was twisted. A rival from the Democratic primary race who had blasted him as being supportive of school segregation was now his running mate. Kamala Harris had even said on his campaign trail that she believed the allegations that Joe Biden was a sexual predator. Yet all of this was water under the bridge. Kamala Harris was Joe Biden's running mate, the Democratic Party's nominee for vice president. So what was going on behind the scenes? Who was pushing for Kamala Harris? Who was desperately opposing her? Where does Kamala Harris come from? And what does it teach us about American politics in our time? These are questions that will be answered by this short booklet. The Queen of Mass Incarceration. Kamala did rather poorly in the Democratic primary. Her personality and record doesn't really appeal to U.S. voters, especially in the swing states Biden needs to win. The most damning moment for Kamala's 2020 presidential campaign came on July 31st, 2019. Rival candidate Tulsi Gabbard used her limited time during a debate to highlight Kamala's record as a criminal prosecutor. Hawaii Congresswoman Gabbard crammed a lot into just a few seconds. Kamala Harris says she's proud of her record. I'm concerned about the record of Senator Harris. She put over 1,500 people in jail for marijuana violations and laughed about it when she was asked if she ever smoked marijuana. She blocked evidence that would have freed an innocent man from death row. She kept people in prison beyond their sentences to use them as cheap labor for the state of California, and she fought to keep the cash bail system in place that impacts poor people in the worst kind of way. Kamala had no rebuttal to these obviously true facts about her career as a prosecutor and attorney general in California. In fact, Gabbard's statements were just the tip of the iceberg. Kamala Harris had imprisoned parents due to their children being truant from school and laughed about it during a presentation. Kamala Harris also mocked protesters against the prison industrial complex, speaking in a sarcastic voice, strutting around the stage of a Chicago Ideas Forum saying, "Build more schools, less jails. Build more schools, less jails. Put money into education, not prisons." There's a fundamental problem with that approach, in my opinion. You still haven't addressed why I have 3 padlocks on my front door. There should be a broad consensus that there should be a serious and severe and swift consequences to crime. The idea of serious and severe and swift consequences is something that seems to arouse Kamala Harris. She was desperate to have Kevin Cooper executed and battled in court, hoping to prevent the DNA evidence California Governor Gavin Newsom requested. The evidence was acquired against Kamala's wishes, and Kevin Cooper's execution was halted. She now says that she feels awful about this and blames lower-level attorneys for the decision. Kevin Cooper remains in prison, though he has left death row. Kamala's office as California Attorney General worked to prevent nonviolent offenders from being released from California prisons. After the state Supreme Court ruled the prisons were unconstitutionally overcrowded, the reason to keep people locked was, if Forrester released these inmates early, prisons would lose an important labor pool. Harris secured a conviction of over 1,900 for marijuana, a few hundred more than Tulsi's number, and did indeed laugh about it when asked if she ever recreationally utilized cannabis herself. Almost 2,000 people received criminal records and often jail time for doing something Kamala apparently did herself. As she laughed about it on the Breakfast Club radio program, the video of the interview reveals a face that is clearly oblivious to the hypocrisy to which she is confessing. The lives she destroyed are a mere bureaucratic detail, forgotten and tucked away as she strives for more personal glory and fame. When asked what music she had listened to as she smoked pot as a college student, she said it had to be Snoop, referring to rapper Snoop Dogg. Many bloggers noted that the time in which Kamala Harris was a college student and the musical career of Snoop Dogg did not align. Kamala's post-secondary education took place long before Snoop Dogg's rap albums even hit the shelves. She was most likely lying. Many Black voters have criticized the Jamaican Indian American woman's various attempts to pander to the residents of the urban Black communities who she took delight in imprisoning as San Francisco Attorney General. Writing for Reason.com, C.J. Sierra Miller writes, whenever Harris is pressed about specific instances where she was decidedly unprogressive, she dodges, misleads, or glosses over the facts. His research points out that as a prosecutor, Kamala Harris defended the death penalty, always running on the platform of keeping it in practice in California. She opposed increasing oversight of police officers and investigating fatal shootings. Her office fought against exonerating the wrongfully convicted and protected the Orange County District Attorney's Office after it was caught operating an unconstitutional jailhouse snitching program. Judges repeatedly called out Kamala Harris and her office for withholding evidence, not notifying defense attorneys of misconduct by drug lab technicians, and having a level of indifference when it came to unethical and illegal practices that could help secure criminal convictions. Not from the thin blue line milieu. The behavior of Kamala Harris as the San Francisco District Attorney and as the California Attorney General is morally horrendous. The efforts to destroy the lives of innocent people and to manipulate the California legal system in order to do it should disturb anyone who believes in justice or who poses empathy, most especially someone with a leftist, anti-oppression worldview. How many nonviolent citizens ended up behind bars or with criminal records simply for the victimless crime of smoking pot? How many innocent people were convicted due to her practice of withholding evidence to hurt the defense? What kind of person would actively oppose utilizing DNA evidence to exonerate people on death row? Did the potential of taking an innocent person's life not concern her? Clearly not. Harris's behavior might make sense if she was part of the thin blue line milieu. Police officers, their family members, the various police unions, and the Fraternal Order of Police often cultivate a strange victim mentality and reinterpretation of events. Adherents of this right-wing layer of U.S. society believe police brutality is a liberal hoax and that the annually occurring deaths as officers on the job are the fault of anti-racist activists. In the minds of those who operate within the alternative reality of the thin blue line, the U.S. suffers from an overextension of civil liberties to protect criminals. They see the police as under siege from the radical left and an overly compassionate society that coddles criminals. This refers not only to law enforcement officials themselves, but also to various right-wing vigilantes and fanatics like the infamous George Zimmerman, who buy into this worldview. This viewpoint is simply contrary to the reality. The United States has more prisoners than any other country in the world, not just in numbers, but in percentage. Juries across the country rarely acquit, and very few defendants even bother to risk going to trial. However, the illusions of the thin blue line narrative are often utilized by prosecutors and police officers to justify their own misconduct, the kind of misconduct Kamala Harris specialized in. Prosecutors and police officers who feel that racism is a liberal anti-cop myth often feel that they must lie, brutalize people, withhold evidence, and fight dirty in defense of law and order. Various TV programs and films feature a heroic dirty cop who breaks the law and flouts legal procedure in order to put away a bad guy. However, Kamala Harris is not the daughter of police officers. She does not come from the thin blue line milieu. As shocking as it may sound, her parents are both left-wing activists. In Harris's autobiography, The Truths We Hold, published in 2019, she wrote, "America has a deep and dark history of people using the power of the prosecutor as an instrument of injustice. I know this history well, of innocent men framed, of charges brought against the people of color without sufficient evidence, of prosecutors hiding information that would exonerate defendants, of the disproportionate application of the law." The opening chapters of The Truths We Hold describes how her parents met each other through attending civil rights and anti-Vietnam War protests in Berkeley, California. She writes, "My parents often brought me in a stroller with them to civil rights marches. I have young memories of a sea of legs moving about, of energy and shouts and chants. Social justice was a central part of family discussions." Describing her parents, she wrote, "They went to peaceful protests that were attacked by the police with fire hoses. They marched against the Vietnam War and for voting rights and civil rights." She described being a toddler of attending a daycare that was small but welcoming, with posters of Frederick Douglass, Sojourner Truth, and Harriet Tubman on the wall. A child of the Berkeley New Left, Indeed, Berkeley, California in the 1960s was the epicenter of a cultural movement that swept the United States and Western Europe in what was called the New Left. Both of her parents attended University of California, Berkeley. In the year of Kamala's birth, students at University of California, Berkeley had launched the free speech movement. The university administration had forbidden students from organizing around off-campus issues. The students demanded the rights to engage in political activism on campus and engaged in a campaign of civil disobedience, eventually forcing the university to back down. On October 1st, 1964, a student named Jack Weinberg set up a literature table promoting civil rights. He was arrested, but thousands of students surrounded the police car, blocking it from taking him in for booking. The students held the police car for 32 hours, setting up a microphone on top of it and using it as a miniature stage. Later in December of that year, student leader Mario Savio thundered his famous words to a gathering of student activists, saying, "There is a time when the operation of the machine becomes so odious, makes you so sick at heart, that you can't take part. You can't even passively take part. You've got to put your bodies upon the gears and upon the wheels, upon the levers, upon all the apparatus, and you've got to make it stop. And you've got to indicate to the people who run it, to the people who own it, that unless you're free, the machine will be prevented from working at all." The Communist Party, the Socialist Workers' Party, the Progressive Labor Party, and various Marxist-Leninist groups were certainly involved in the free speech movement and the various left-wing protests in Berkeley during the era. The Black Panther Party raised money for shotguns by selling Mao Zedong's Little Red Book on the campus. Many of the most prominent leaders of the various remaining Marxist-Leninist sects in the United States began their activism in Berkeley. Bob Avakian, who now leads the Revolutionary Communist Party, was a Berkeley native and the son of local judge Spurgeon Avakian. He was heavily involved in the free speech movement and later the founding of the California Peace and Freedom Party. The Trotskyite International Socialist Organization was the largest Marxist cadre organization in the USA in the 1980s and 90s. The organization traces its roots back to the Berkeley Independent Socialist Club. Shaktrinite Trotskyists who joined the free speech protests, Jerry Rubin, leader of the Yippies, who was a household name radical during the late 1960s, began his activism as an organizer of the Berkeley Vietnam Day Committee. Events in Berkeley during the 1960s significantly impacted the entire country. Ronald Reagan's reputation among conservatives on the national stage greatly expanded as he pounded the podium against the mess at Berkeley and cracked down on leftist students activists as California's governor. The Bay Area radical magazine Ramparts became an essential source of news and analysis for left-wing activists all throughout the country. Ramparts introduced the country to the writings of imprisoned black radical Eldridge Cleaver, whose book Soul on Ice was widely studied. Cleaver eventually became a leader of the Black Panther Party after being released from prison. The editor at Ramparts was David Horowitz, a young radical whose parents had been heavily involved in the Communist Party USA. Horowitz eventually became a neoconservative during the 1980s and repudiated his years of left-wing journalism and activism. Covert manipulation of leftist activism. As radical politics flourished in Berkeley during the 1960s, something else was happening beneath the surface. At the time, it was only speculated about. Rumors of government drug distributions and covert CIA funding of Trotskyists persisted, especially among hardline communists, but nobody really knew what was going on for sure. Now, due to the leaks and congressional investigations and documents released by the Freedom of Information Act, we know that one of the most successful intelligence operations ever conducted by the CIA was in full swing. With the Congress for Cultural Freedom program, the CIA was covertly funding left-wing artists, writers, and activists in the hopes of redirecting them to oppose the Soviet Union and China. The New Left was synthetically created as a makeshift intellectual barrier between the circles of free thinkers, intellectuals, and dissidents in Western countries and the Soviet Union. The CIA's website currently brags about the program. New York City Trotskyite professor Sidney Hook, the lone socialist voice advocating a total ban of the Communist Party USA, wrote enthusiastically about the program, asking for funds. Give me $100 million and 1,000 dedicated people, and I'll guarantee to generate such a wave of democratic unrest among the masses, yes, even among the soldiers of Stalin's own empire, that all his problems for a long period of time to come will be internal. I can find the people. According to CIA.gov, the agency's work was conducted by a cadre of energetic and well-connected staffers willing to experiment with unorthodox ideas and controversial individuals if that was what it took to challenge the communists at their own game. Ruth Fischer, a founding member of the German Communist Party who had joined the Trotskyists, cooperated with the program. James Berman, another Trotskyist who eventually became a neoconservative, threw himself into the covert operation. The official leader of the Congress for Cultural Freedom program was Irving Kristol, a member of Max Shachtman's Independent Socialist League, who would later become the ideological father of the neoconservative movement during the 1970s and 80s. A number of cultural magazines were established in order to highlight the work of anti-communist leftists. In the United States, the Partisan Review flooded the universities, highlighting the voices of figures like Susan Sontag, Irving Howe, Mary McCarthy, and Hannah Arendt. In Germany, Melvin Lasky set up Der Monat to highlight the writings of Herbert Marcuse, Theodor Adorno, and the Frankfurt School, a dissident group of academic Marxists who opposed the Soviet Union and critiqued consumer culture. Max Shachtman was the leader of the third camp wing of Trotskyism and had rejected Trotsky's claim that the USSR was a deformed worker state. He functioned as a kind of elderly mentor to a crew of young CIA-backed freethinkers whose job was to manipulate leftists to oppose the Soviet Union. Shachtman eventually moved on to become the personal advisor to George Meany, president of the AFL-CIO. Michael Harrington, a young intellectual mentored by Max Shachtman, authored a best-selling book called The Other America, highlighting poverty across the United States. Harrington eventually worked with the Lyndon Johnson administration, overseeing the establishment of welfare programs. With funding from the United Auto Workers Union, Harrington established Students for a Democratic Society as an anti-communist, pro-civil rights campus activist group. Funding from the Ford Foundation, Rockefeller think tanks, and other powerful entities enabled the Institute for Policy Studies to be established as a safe outlet for left-wing criticism of U.S. foreign policy and the military-industrial complex. To put it simply, the New Left was fake. It was a covert strategy for opposing communism invented by the intelligence apparatus. Prior to the 1950s, the Communist Party stood almost alone on the vanguard of opposing racism. Black intellectuals like W. E. Du Bois, Paul Robeson, Langston Hughes, and William L. Patterson joined the Communist Party and saw the Soviet Union as a key ally of black people against racism. In 1949, the Communist Party USA organized a highly successful conference at the Waldorf Astoria Hotel in New York City. Scientists like Albert Einstein, actors like Howard Fast, and many of the most prominent cultural figures had attended and participated in a pro-Soviet peace conference. The job of the CIA was to create a chorus of left-wing voices who could invoke Marxist language and the rebellious spirit found in many intellectuals, while covertly supporting U.S. foreign policy goals. The stated aim was to create a way for peace activists and Black civil rights activists to no longer see themselves as natural allies to the Soviet Union. The Cultural Cold War. In her memoir, Kamala Harris describes how much of her childhood was spent at an African American cultural center in Berkeley called Rainbow Sign. This facility, which functioned as theater, musical performance space, and restaurant, existed in Berkeley from 1971 to 1977, directed by community activist Marianne Pauler. It is unclear who funded this space. My mother Maya and I went to Rainbow Sign often, Kamala writes. Everyone in the neighborhood knew us as Sharmila and the girls. We were a unit, a team. And when we show up, we were always greeted with big smiles and warm hugs. Rainbow Sign had a communal orientation and an inclusive vibe. Among those who performed there are a number of Black intellectuals whose work was covertly supported by the CIA as an alternative to pro-communist and anti-imperialist Black activists. James Baldwin was a particular favorite of the CIA, and the covertly funded Paris Review magazine directed by Perrin Matheson was used to make his anti-racist writings famous. The book Finks, How the CIA Tricked the World's Best Writers by Joel Whitney describes in detail how the CIA covertly funded and promoted James Baldwin's work and sought to marginalize W. E. Du Bois. Kamala Harris notes that Marianne Pauler was a personal friend of James Baldwin and that he frequently visited the Rainbow Sign facility. Rainbow Sign was part of what was called the Black Arts Movement of the 1950s and 60s, which was the continuation of the Harlem Renaissance. It highlighted the work of African American poets, writers, musicians, and painters. Researcher Adrian J. Mack notes that CIA's Congress for Cultural Freedom program was heavily involved in promoting the work of anti-communist Black artists. The CIA helped organize the 1966 First Negro World Arts Festival in Senegal. Mack writes, the United States controlled who attended the event, and the government believed U.S. representation would improve the nation's image during the Cold War era. It comes as no surprise that the United States had gatekeepers in place to support the logistics surrounding the international festival, since the United States was strategizing how to globally contain communism. See the Black Arts Movements, the Congress for Cultural Freedom and Cultural Discourse by Adrian J. Mack, November 27, 2018. Kamala Harris recalls that she and her sister sang a performance of Free to Be You and Me. The music from this 1972 feminist children's album, eventually produced as an ABC TV special in 1974, was certainly popular in liberal circles during the era. The songs and poems decry traditional gender roles, telling boys it's all right to cry, and urging married couples to do housework together. Gloria Steinem, editor of Miss Magazine and the face of the 1970s feminist movement in the United States, was heavily involved in putting the album and TV special together. Gloria Steinem's ties to the CIA are well documented. In 1962, the World Festival of Youth and Students took place in Vienna. It was a gathering of communist and anti-imperialist youth. The young Gloria Steinem coordinated CIA efforts to disrupt it. Steinem established an organization called the Independent Research Service as a front organization that attended the festival in order to do intelligence work. A New York Times article published on February 21st, 1967, described Steinem's work as the 1962 gathering. Gloria Steinem, a 30-year-old graduate of Smith College, said the CIA had been a major source of the funds for the foundation, the Independence Research Service, since its foundation in 1958. Almost all of the young persons who received aid from the foundation did not know about the relationship with the intelligence agency, Ms. Steinman said. Ironically, she said many of the students who attended the festivals have been criticized as leftists. The festivals are supposed to be financed by contributions from national student unions, but are in fact largely supported by the Soviet Union. Ms. Steinman said she had become convinced that American students should participate in the World Youth Festivals after she spent 2 years in India. I came home in 1958 full of idealism and activism to discover that very little was being done, she said. Students were not taken seriously here before the Civil Rights Movement, and private money receded at the mention of a communist youth festival. In her book, My Life on the Road, Steinman described her relationship with the agency, writing that the CIA, in my experience, was completely different from its image. It was liberal, nonviolent, and honorable. Interestingly, Free to Be You and Me would eventually be continued by a TV special in 1988 that played a far more obvious role in anti-communism and geopolitics. In 1988, a follow-up children's TV program entitled Free to Be, a family that aimed to destigmatize single motherhood, was aired as a joint broadcast of ABC and Soviet state television. The program, aired in both Russian and English, featured the Muppets and attempted to build up trust for the United States among the Soviet population. Actress Marlo Thomas hosted the broadcast, which featured Ben Jovi, Robin Williams, Lily Tomlin, and Penn and Teller. The program was essentially an advertisement for the U.S. media and Hollywood, reinforcing the position of the Gorbachev wing of the Soviet Communist Party, which viewed the United States as a friendly country that meant no harm to the Russian people. While spy movies feature the CIA as engaged in James Bond-like action adventures, one of the most primary activities of the U.S. intelligence apparatus is controlling and crafting U.S. culture. Joel Whitney's book Finks describes how the U.S. covertly worked within major Hollywood studios to ensure that featured films fit in with U.S. foreign policy goals, for example. Berkeley was very much the New Left's epicenter. Nearby in the Bay Area's Hyde-Ashburg neighborhood, the CIA ran a series of experiments with LSD. What was later revealed to be known as Operation Midnight Climax, a part of Project MKUltra, involved CIA agents distributing LSD all over the city. Berkeley was very much the New Left's epicenter. Nearby in the Bay Area's Hyde-Ashburg neighborhood, the CIA ran a series of experiments with LSD, what was later revealed to be known as Operation Midnight Climax, a part of Project MKUltra, involved CIA agents distributing LSD all over the city. Prostitutes lured clients to CIA safe houses where they were held captive and given doses of LSD. People on beaches and in restaurants were randomly handed pills by strangers dressed like hippies. This program was discussed in depth during testimony before the Congressional Church Committee. The Congressional Committee investigated and exposed a wide range of illegal activities of the CIA and FBI during the late 1970s. In an era when Marxist-Leninists were the primary geopolitical rivals of the United States and global networks of communist parties existed to expose U.S. imperialism, manipulating left-wing artists was one of the prime activities of the CIA. The New Left was a cultural and political movement the CIA specifically engineered for geopolitical purposes. While Marxist-Leninist parties focused on building disciplined cadre organizations aiming to mobilize U.S. workers to seize power, the New Left of dope-smoking, middle-class freaks was quite useful in pulling potential revolutionaries away from them. It was in its intentionally cultivated and covertly supported milieu of non-communist radicals that Kamala Harris was raised. She does not conceal this fact at all, but boast about it in the era of Black Lives Matter as almost a political credential. Two factions in the American ruling class. After Kamala Harris was selected as Joe Biden's pick for vice president, conservative speaker Charlie Kirk tweeted, "Kamala Harris is a Marxist." The fact that Kamala's parents had protested and her father taught economics from a Marxian perspective at Stanford University is presented as proof in right-wing media that she is a full-fledged communist. A similar atmosphere of anti-communist hysteria was created around Barack Obama and his family's ties to CIA-linked liberal activism in academia. However, it is not only conservatives that make this error. Among leftists, it is often assumed that only the right wing are supported by U.S. intelligence agencies. Liberals and moderate socialists may be decried as zealots or compromisers, but it is assumed that their efforts could not be supported by the ruling class or the state apparatus. Among leftists, the general viewpoint is that the movement is a force for good and the entire state apparatus opposes it. This is an illusion. Kamala Harris grew up in a milieu that did not support communism, but functioned as a barrier against it, cultivated following the failure of McCarthyism. The political crisis of the 1960s and 70s can accurately be described as a division within the U.S. ruling class. The 1976 book, The Yankee and Cowboy War, by Carl Oglesby, describes a conflict among the rich and powerful in the United States that was underlying the turmoil of the era. Oglesby draws from Carroll Quigley and other academics to describe the Eastern establishment of New England, old money, and big oil, which has a history of clashing with other sections of the rich and powerful, namely weapons manufacturers and industrialists. In the 1960s, corporations tied to the defense industry, the FBI, and most of America's millionaires favored the Republican Party, social conservatism, and an increased role of the U.S. military around the world. However, the Rockefellers, an ultra-rich oil banking dynasty, worked with the CIA to covertly fund abstract artists and leftist criticism of U.S. society. The Rockefellers funded the research of Alfred Kinsey, who argued that sexual promiscuity and homosexuality were more common. They also founded the Birth Control League of Margaret Sanger, now known as Planned Parenthood. The Rockefeller think tanks such as the Asia Society and the Council on Foreign Relations tended to favor cooperation with Western European allies and soft power rather than military escalation as a method for defeating communists. Despite being ultra-wealthy and vehemently in favor of capitalism, the Rockefellers were widely accused of being communists by the John Birch Society and other anti-communist fanatics. In his study of the political role of the American oil dynasty, the Rockefeller Syndrome, Ferdinand Lundberg wrote, "What is the fundamental cultural orientation of the Rockefellers? They are certainly progressives, modernists, rationalists, children of the Enlightenment, anything but obscurantists, leaving aside economics and politics. But they are progressives strictly within the ambience of a murky status quo, subject at most to slow and bit-by-bit change. They do believe in slow change because they know change to be inevitable, but the emphasis is on slow. Whatever people find irksome about the status quo, the Rockefellers believe is fully admissible to reform, eventually. Although mild progressive reforms, belief in treatment of symptoms, not causes, they are far from being broad-front political liberals." In his book, Market Elections, Vince Copeland wrote that in 1964, when Nelson Rockefeller denounced Republican presidential candidate Barry Goldwater, he was most likely responding to attacks leveled against his family by other conservatives. Defense contractors, McCarthyists, and others saw the Rockefellers as a threat. Copeland writes, "It was Rockefeller's own fear at the time, his actual fear of being inundated by right-wing opposition that was going for his own throat, regardless of his impeccable credentials as a bloodthirsty exploiter himself. It was this self-preserving fear that spoke about fascism." Essentially, the question facing the U.S. ruling class during the Cold War was, How can we defeat communism? The industrial capitalists and the military favored establishing an authoritarian and heavily militarized society that would reinforce religion and patriotism. Lots of weapons could be sold, domestic labor unions could be crushed, and society could be mobilized to lock down for an all-out effort to defeat the Reds, much as Hitler and Mussolini had done in Europe prior to the Second World War. Henry Ford, J.P. Morgan, and the National Association of Manufacturers and General Motors had a history of sympathy towards fascists prior to the Second World War. They saw highly authoritarian and military methods as the best strategy for defeating communism. However, the Rockefellers, the intelligence agencies, and the Eastern establishment tied in with European capital had an alternative view. They argued that the way to defeat the communists was by stealing their thunder, enacting progressive social reforms, co-opting social movements, and thus stabilizing U.S. society. The Cold War liberals presented a kind of anti-totalitarianism similar to the perspective presented on TV programs like The Twilight Zone. The enemy is totalitarianism, of which communism and fascism are merely alternative brands. Liberal ideas like freedom of speech, freedom of religion, and equal rights should be maximized. The authoritarian tendencies of the military should be restricted, all in order to disprove the allegations of Marxist agitators and prevent greater social unrest and tensions. The trajectory of U.S. politics. The rise of Kamala Harris to the position of Democratic vice presidential nominee in 2020 fits in with the trajectory of political and cultural battles that have taken place in the United States since the end of the Second World War. In the post-World War II era, different interests and groupings within the U.S. capitalist class have been directing the state apparatus in an effort to control the domestic population and beat back the rise of anti-imperialist and socialist governments around the world. Political discourse in the United States has evolved based on the needs of different factions within the ruling class, domestically and internationally. Reviewing quickly how U.S. politics and culture has evolved since the end of the Second World War will ultimately explain where Kamala Harris came from. McCarthyism, 1946 to 1956. From 1946 to 1956, U.S. politics was dominated by a right-wing mobilization referred to as McCarthyism. The U.S. ruling class saw the expansion of the socialist camp in Eastern Europe and the rising popularity of communism around the world and mobilized to weaken any Marxist influence at home. The newly widespread accessibility of television enabled the population to be very effectively psyched up into fear of the Soviet Union and hatred toward communists. In the first years of McCarthyism, the Roosevelt wing of the Democratic Party, which favored cooperation with the Soviet Union, had deep roots in organized labor, was crushed. Figures like Henry Wallace and Alger Hiss were demonized as Soviet agents. The Communist Party USA's national leadership was imprisoned. Communists were barred from the leadership of labor unions. Hollywood screenwriters and actors were called before congressional committees and jailed for refusing to name names. In 1949, the victory of the Chinese Revolution emboldened the anti-communist hysteria. Republicans declared that the Democratic Party had lost China to the Reds. Republican Senator Joe McCarthy ascended to popularity, decrying an alleged communist conspiracy within the U.S. State Department. A crackdown, not just on left-wing activism, but also on homosexuality and pornography, also took place across the country. The 1951 McCarran International Security Act assigned the U.S. Justice Department to assemble a list of 2 million people to be placed in concentration camps amid a national emergency. In 1953, Julius and Ethel Rosenberg were executed despite widespread opposition both domestically and internationally. After Stalin's death, it became clear that his successors favored negotiating with the United States and were willing to restrain Soviet-aligned activists around the world in exchange for a softening of relations. However, much of the U.S. population was still reeling with the anti-communism and was hostile to such negotiations. Many middle-class elements utilized McCarthyism to express their rage at the ultra-rich and powerful institutions in U.S. society. In 1954, Joe McCarthy accused the U.S. Army of being controlled by communists. The extreme right opposed the strategy of utilizing Tito's Yugoslavia as an ally against the Soviet Union in Eastern Europe. Institutions like the Methodist Church became the target of McCarthyist allegations. U.S. Senator Lester C. Hunt committed suicide in response to McCarthy's threats against him. U.S. mainstream media turned against Joe McCarthy largely because many believed his activities were hurting U.S. foreign policy and causing domestic instability. McCarthy was censured by the U.S. Congress and eventually drank himself to death. The Hollywood blacklist gradually faded, and the atmosphere of hysterical anti-communism died down as the decade went on. The New Left, 1961 to 1972. In response to McCarthyism, a wave of liberal anti-totalitarianism expanded. The northern wing of the Democratic Party, including the Kennedy family, embraced the civil rights movement. Much of the activism of Martin Luther King Jr. was directly paid for by the United Auto Workers Union. Many liberal elements felt that Jim Crow segregation made the United States look hypocritical in its denunciations of the Soviet Union, and that the race question was a ticking time bomb which communists could utilize to sow unrest. In 1961, Republican President Dwight Eisenhower warned about the dangerous influence of weapons manufacturers and war profiteers in Washington, D.C. On national television, he stated, "In the councils of government, we must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex. The potential for the disastrous rise of misplaced power exists and will persist." Many within the intelligence apparatus felt covert methods were more effective in defeating communists, but the influence of weapons manufacturers on elected officials made big wars with mass bombings of civilians hard to prevent. As early as the 1950s, the CIA had begun covertly funding the New Left as a way to prevent the millions of young liberals reacting negatively to McCarthyism and militarism from becoming communists. The Congress for Cultural Freedom program spawned a layer of anti-totalitarian freethinkers who pushed a message opposing conformity and equating Soviet communism with Nazi fascism. Among this crowd of liberal artists and academics is where Kamala Harris' parents met at UC Berkeley. Her memoirs confirm that she spent her childhood among it, attended civil rights marches, and singing in performances at Rainbow Sign Cultural Center. Articulating the sentiments of Cold War liberals, John F. Kennedy said, "Those who make peaceful revolution impossible make violent revolution inevitable," and argued that the best way to prevent communist revolutions was by industrializing and stabilizing third world countries with foreign aid. Following Kennedy's assassination, the Vietnam War escalated. CIA-linked intellectuals like Zbigniew Brzezinski formed the National Committee for a Political Settlement in Vietnam, also known as Negotiate Now. France and other European countries became vocally critical of U.S. military involvement in Vietnam. As the CIA pushed for a de-escalation of the Vietnam War, American media oversaw a cultural revolution. Talk of the generation gap was widespread. As the younger generation became enthusiastic about rock and roll music and hippie counterculture, drug use became widespread. U.S. Attorney General Ramsey Clark presented a sympathetic face to the civil rights movement and dispatched federal agents to enforce the Civil Rights Act and Voting Rights Act. Clark attempted to restrain the FBI's efforts against the civil rights and peace movements. Clark also released a number of federal prisoners. However, the efforts of the Cold War liberals did not result in a de-escalation domestically or internationally. In 1968, the underlying political unrest among African Americans and white college students exploited into massive social unrest. The year began with the Tet Offensive in Vietnam, a huge, unpredictable wave of defeats for U.S. forces at the hands of the communist-led National Liberation Front. After the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. in April, urban rebellion swept the country, and the National Guard was dispatched across the country. At the Democratic National Convention in Chicago, peace activists clashed with the police in response to the nomination of pro-Vietnam War candidate Herbert Humphrey against the wishes of the majority of rank-and-file Democrats. Students for a Democratic Society, originally formed as an anti-communist liberal activist group, became dominated by Marxist liberal factions and eventually split its 1969 convention. Within the New Left, communist factions has maneuvered effectively and gained influence over many young activists. Protests across the country became more militant and often featured Vietnamese flags. The Black Panther Party, a Marxist-Leninist organization of armed African Americans, became widely popular. The group had ties to China, the Soviet Union, North Korea, Libya, and many other anti-imperialist states. The feeling among the U.S. elite was just that as McCarthyism had gone out of control, now the New Left had gone also out of control. Society at home was unstable, and the rabble were making their international efforts difficult once again. While the Rockefellers had long distrusted him, Richard Nixon was victorious in the 1968 election, promising to end the wave of social unrest. Richard Nixon ran as the law and order candidate who represented the silent majority that was disgusted with protests and urban rebellions. Nixon fired Ramsey Clark and allowed the FBI to crush the Black Panther Party. Nixon escalated and then ended the Vietnam War and enacted a series of dramatic reforms to U.S. society in the hopes of quelling unrest. Nixon lowered the voting age to 18, created the Environmental Protection Agency, enacted federal affirmative action policies in hiring, and followed the foreign policy strategy of Henry Kissinger, meeting with Mao and utilizing China as an ally against the Soviet Union. Despite effectively ending the political crisis of 1968 to 1972 with a combination of heavy political repression and social reforms, Nixon was forced out of office following the Watergate scandal. The press viewed him as a right-wing fanatic with authoritarian tendencies. Neoconservatism and the Religious Right, 1974 to 2004. Following the political turmoil created by the New Left and the clash within the U.S. ruling class over civil rights and the Vietnam War, what can be called the late Cold War normal in U.S. politics gradually began to set in. Nixon had utilized a kind of pseudo-populist contempt for black activists and pseudo-radicals in order to win the elections. Hit songs like Merle Haggard's "Okie from Muskogee" voiced the opposition of the New Left and held the attention of many white working-class people across the country. In 1970, Nixon supporters among New York City's construction workers launched hard hat riots and began beating up anti-war protesters. Bumper stickers with slogans like "My country right or wrong" popularized the idea that dissidents and protesters were disloyal to the country. This all fit the political strategy of Leo Strauss, a philosophy professor who mentored many students who went on to become prominent intellectuals and political figures in the United States. He argued that politics should be dumbed down and that average Americans should see it in simplistic terms. An article from The Nation describes Strauss's influence as intellectuals, he believed, would have to spread an ideology of good and evil, whether they believe it or not, so that the American people could be mobilized against the enemies of freedom. For this reason, Strauss, we learn, in one of many telling asides, was a huge fan of the TV series Gunsmoke and its Manichean depiction of good and evil. Beware the Holy War by Peter Bergen, June 2nd, 2005. A trend among U.S. elites favored military interventionism while dumbing down political discourse and portraying the left as disloyal and deranged intellectuals. This became known as neoconservatism, the academic field nicknamed Sovietology that focused on Cold War strategy became dominated by this kind of thinking. Irving Kristol, once the director of the CIA's Congress for Cultural Freedom, became a primary theorist of the neoconservative movement along with Leo Strauss. The Republican Party began making overtures to a particular faction among the hippie counterculture known as Jesus people or Jesus freaks. Religion, an important plank of American conservatism, was in crisis as young people became increasingly irreverent and cynical during the political crisis of 1968 to 1972. Despite the irreverence of these peers and fellow counterculture enthusiasts, the Jesus people stood on street corners singing hymns and preaching Christianity while opposing the Vietnam War and supporting civil rights. The right saw an opening, and a fanatical anti-communist pastor from South Korea, Reverend Seo Myung-moon, was imported into the United States. Moon had long been cooperating with the U.S. intelligence, and the United States has begun recruiting young people to his peace movement that supported Richard Nixon. Moon's followers appear to be part of the counterculture, but their beliefs aligned with the weapons manufacturers and the Republican Party. Moon owned a number of weapons manufacturing facilities himself, having acquired the copyright to producing M16 rifles in South Korea. Moon's followers became foot soldiers of the neoconservatives, setting the stage for what would eventually become a much bigger trend. Tony Alamo, a Beatles marketer who worked in the music industry, launched his own cult among the Jesus people. His followers recruited teenage runaways in Los Angeles, and much like Moon, despite the hippie aesthetics, they aligned with Republicans and weapons manufacturers. Nixon's spiritual advisor, the famed evangelicist Reverend Billy Graham, began featuring long-haired, guitar-playing youth on his television broadcast, The Jesus People, suddenly became far more widely promoted in American media, though their politics were dramatically shifting. In 1974, Baptist minister Reverend Jerry Falwell launched an organization called the Moral Majority that pushed conservative politics enmeshed in religious fanaticism. All this eventually culminated in the process of conservative Protestant Christianity in the United States reinventing itself. By the late 1970s, what would be described as the religious right of the Republican Party, patriotic anti-communist, and military-aligned conservatives emerged to re-energize the right wing. They were aligned with weapons manufacturers, they were fanatically anti-communist, and they were ardent supporters of Israel. The hard hats of patriotic working-class conservatives who favored the military, along with religious fanatics singing rock and roll hymns and promoting a dumbed-down version of Christianity, formed the core of solid support that held U.S. society together for the remainder of the Cold War and up into the 21st century. The Reagan White House solidified neoconservatism as a political trend. The Republicans favored a military escalation against communists while opposing homosexuality and abortion. In the new late Cold War normal, Republicans wrapped themselves in patriotism, anti-communism, and Christianity, as did the Democrats, though to a somewhat milder degree. Divisions in the ruling class seemed to be pretty much smoothed over during the 1980s. Reagan was known for saying, "We are all friends after 6, indicating that differences among Democrats and Republicans were not that significant. The neoconservatives and the religious right functioned as the hardliners of America who dominated key state institutions. Liberals who essentially agreed with their narrative of world events just favored a softer approach. Bill Clinton's Democratic Leadership Council pushed the Democratic Party further to the right, putting it more in line with the overall neocon agenda. Mass incarceration was a big part of the late Cold War normal. The war on drugs dramatically increased the prison population, with Democrats and Republicans both emphasizing a tone of tough-on crime in their rhetoric. The lock-em-up rhetoric and policies that Kamala Harris is closely associated with had emerged in the 1980s, but continued to expand in the following decade. Kamala Harris began working as a deputy district attorney in Alameda County, California in 1990. Eventually, she became assistant district attorney for San Francisco in 1998. Kamala's formative years were working within the prosecutorial side of the criminal justice system in California as the state's prison population exploded. According to the San Francisco Gate, the number of people incarcerated in federal and state prisons and county jails in California grew by nearly 40% between 1990 and 2000 to a total of 249,000 inmates. Although the jump outstripped the state's population increase of 14%, it represented a major slowdown since the 1980s, when the state's prisons and jails population exploded by an unprecedented 228%, according to San Francisco Gate, August 9, 2001. These were the years when the talk of super predators, a pseudo-psychological term used to demonize young African American men, was all over television. The media routinely demonized Black culture, blaming rap music for crime and soaking up a fear of gangs used to justify police crackdowns. Across the country, testimony from gang experts with no direct knowledge about cases helped convict defendants in court. The gang experts would tell horrifying stories that terrified jurors about how potentially dangerous an accused Black male was, securing the convictions of many African American men. The Los Angeles Rebellion of 1992, in response to the Rodney King verdict, and the 1995 Black Nationalist Rally in Washington, D.C., called the Million Man March, led by Minister Louis Farrakhan, represented a significant pushback against the rising police state from the African American community. However, few within either the Democratic or Republican parties were sympathetic to these uprisings. Huge protests and an unexpected wave of international opposition prevented the execution of former Black Panther leader Mumia Abu-Jamal in 1996. The late Cold War normal of U.S. politics persisted long after the fall of the Soviet Union. The setup of hardliner neocons and evangelicals as a solid core of U.S. society, with liberals as their loyal opposition, persisted into the final years of the Bush administration, when the financial crisis and the new realities of the geopolitical stage forced an adjustment. Obama, new atheists, and privileged politics. In response to the September 11th attacks, the United States led NATO countries to invade Afghanistan, and shortly afterward, the USA unilaterally invaded Iraq. The neoconservative core at the center of the U.S. state apparatus was emboldened. These moves came at heavy cost to the United States in terms of long-term geopolitical strength. Demonization of Islam became central in the rhetoric of neoconservatives, Israel supporters, and evangelical Christians. George W. Bush even used the term crusade in reference to his war on terror, sparking outrage across the Muslim world. In the Middle East, the USA had long depended on covert support from the Muslim Brotherhood, Wahhabi fanatics, and others who took deep offense in these sentiments and became distrustful of the United States. Furthermore, many NATO countries had opposed the U.S. invasion of Iraq, and tension between the USA and the countries of the European Union escalated. Meanwhile, the result of Bush's invasion of Iraq, as well as sanctions imposed on Iran and other factors, was a huge surge in oil prices. Not only did the high prices generate huge revenue for U.S. oil companies, but the various anti-imperialist states that sell oil on the international market significantly gained financially. Russia's economy, restructured by Putin beginning in 1999 to be centered around Gazprom and Rosneft, state-run energy firms, surged ahead as oil prices increased state revenue. The Islamic Republic of Iran's hardliner faction regained strength in response to increased U.S. hostility and significantly higher oil revenue, with vehement anti-imperialist and anti-capitalist Ahmadinejad being elected. Iran-backed Hezbollah became highly admired by the Muslims of the world for handling a humiliating defeat to Israel in 2006. In Venezuela, Hugo Chavez utilized the high oil revenue to fund his projects for moving the country toward 21st century socialism. Inspired by his success and aligned with Cuba, Bolivarian socialist governments emerged in Bolivia, Nicaragua, and Ecuador. Meanwhile, episodes of racial unrest broke out sporadically across the United States in response to instances of police brutality. Technology made it easier to record the actions of police with mobile phones. The lack of adequate response to Hurricane Katrina in 2005 sparked huge amounts of anger from the African American community. Wages and living standards among average Americans had been significantly decreasing since the late 1970s. Home foreclosures began to increase among African American neighborhoods in Michigan, Ohio, and California, but soon spread to communities across the nation, culminating in the financial crisis of 2008 to 2009 when the housing bubble burst. Amid financial collapse and rising geopolitical opposition, Barack Obama strolled into the presidency, giving messianic speeches with a wave of fanatical young supporters. His rise came as a result of two significant ideological blows being dealt to the neocon core that sat at the center of the late Cold War normal. The first blow came against the religious right in the form of a widespread and well-promoted trend of religious skepticism. The internet and promotion from liberal newspapers like the New York Times enabled figures like Richard Dawkins, Sam Harris, Christopher Hitchens, and others to garner huge amounts of attention as they presented the old age arguments of religious skeptics. The beliefs of the religious right, namely that the Bible is the literal and infallible word of God, became subject to widespread mockery. TV programs, internet publications, and many prominent voices in U.S. society began to dissect the kind of thinking which Jerry Falwell and Billy Graham had pioneered in the 1970s. The influence of the religious right, an important faction with influence in the U.S. military, significantly decreased, especially among younger Americans. Meanwhile, talk of white privilege, a concept originally developed by Marxist academics like Noel Ignatieff, became widespread in universities. The idea that racism was a thing of the past was suddenly replaced with an understanding that African Americans faced many hardships in life due to their skin color, and that denying this was in itself a form of racism. Universities began requiring students to take courses highlighting the concept of white privilege, and funding for academic departments of race and gender studies from the Ford Foundation, Rockefeller think tanks, and other sources significantly increased. Obama attempted to restore good feelings with the Muslim world and to address the resentments and anger boiling from the African American community about the rising police state. Obama also attempted to stabilize the economy with mild regulations of Wall Street and his Obamacare healthcare reform. It was amid this pushback against neoconservatism that Kamala Harris served as San Francisco District Attorney from 2004 to 2011. It was in 2011, in a political atmosphere tainted by the Arab Spring and the Occupy protests, that Kamala Harris became California's state attorney general. At the time, the African American community had a renewed trust in government institutions due to Obama's ascendancy, though it wouldn't last long. Across Middle America, Tea Party protests were mobilized in which Obama was accused of being a Nazi, communist, or Muslim. The right wing launched efforts to stop his modest reforms with catastrophic alarmist rhetoric. Obama's reforms were mild at best, but at every turn they were labeled communist. The right wing struggled to reinvent itself as anti-establishment sentiments surged following the financial crisis. On Fox News Channel, Glenn Beck began lecturing audiences with McCarthy-era anti-communism, drawing on a chalkboard to explain elaborate theories about the influence of Islam, communism, and George Soros. Libertarianism and non-neoconservative elements suddenly had the upper hand among Republicans, as the last Cold War normal had pretty much been broken. The establishment left also appear to be confused and unclear about how to move forward. Unrest among African Americans escalated as Obama's presidency continued. The fact that a commander-in-chief of African descent was not improving the situation spurred many African Americans to protest in places like Ferguson and Baltimore. Rather than resolving racial unrest, Obama's presidency escalated existing tensions and outrage about the police state and mass incarceration. Meanwhile, despite successfully destroying Libya and Syria, the United States seemed unable to topple the Ba'ath socialist government. Russia and China's economic influence around the world was expanding. While the economy stabilized in the aftermath of the 2008 to 2009 crash, living standards were continuing to decrease. Opioid addiction and suicide were on the rise, and the U.S. life expectancy decreased. Many white Americans felt as if their needs were being ignored, while international affairs and the needs of the African American community took priority. Trump's reaction. Amid the failures of the Obama administration to calm racial unrest, solve economic problems, or roll back the influence of geopolitical rivals of the United States, Trump emerged with his pseudo-populistic nationalism. Like Nixon, he spoke of law and order and a silent majority, and he was hated by many of the neoconservatives within the Republican Party. As U.S. society presents itself in a more liberal way, not just domestically but to the world, right-wing ideas have come to represent a perceived opposition to the status quo. Following the decline of neoconservatism, libertarians and advocates of Austrian school economics, along with conspiracy theorists and isolationists, have taken more of the center stage among conservatives. What was first manifested with Ron Paul and his long-standing constitutionalist opposition to the mainstream of the Republican Party had become more mainstream within the Republican Party. Many neoconservatives have loudly objected to this and denounced Trump. Trump sits at the center of a diverse coalition of interests facing opposition from the highest levels of American capital. His backers include fracking companies, long-standing competitors with the big four supermajor oil companies. They also include individuals tied to military contractors and weapons manufacturers like Betsy DeVos, his billionaire Secretary of Education. Bernie Marcus, the owner of Home Depot, strongly backs Trump, as does Nevada real estate giant Sheldon Adelson. Trump has attached himself to key hawkish constituencies among the country's foreign exile community. Miami Cubans, exiles from Iran, Netanyahu supporting right-wing Israelis, and admirers of Modi in India all throw their weight behind Trump. The desires of these particular interest groups tend to go against the broader U.S. foreign policy apparatus that thinks in terms of long-term global strategy and doesn't share their short-term goals and vendettas. The biggest banks, the four supermajor oil companies, and the Silicon Valley tech giants all incarnate a powerful, globally oriented liberal faction that opposes him. They seek to make the USA more racially inclusive and to destabilize anti-imperialist countries in the name of spreading human rights. They favor a more social democratic model, perhaps involving universal basic incomes to stabilize U.S. society as the populations transition to lower living standards across the board. They favor reduction of consumption in the name of fighting global warming and further integrating the U.S. economy into a global market. While Trump's faction focuses on increasing its own short-term profits, the globalist faction that Trump decrees focuses on maintaining stability while gradually implementing long-term goals. Pouring billions of dollars into research and social engineering, the upper faction of U.S. capital favors gradually and carefully reducing living standards, eliminating anti-imperialist governments around the world, transitioning to a more open global economy, normalizing police state repression in everyday life, and reducing the human population. The Trump coalition views these powerful forces as globalists who are disloyal to the country and seeks to depose them. It blames them for the shortcomings of the Obama administration, for continued economic decline, for failing U.S. foreign policies, and for rising unrest. The Trump movement, with its slogans of America First, is an attempt by the lower levels of American capital to assert its needs against the ultra-rich progressive faction. The pandemic has put these differences pretty clearly on display. Amazon, Walmart, Google, and many of the biggest corporations favored prolonging the lockdown as their profits kept rolling in. Meanwhile, lower-level capitalists like the owners of Hobby Lobby who support Trump or the fracking companies who suffered from a lack of oil demand saw the pandemic drive them into bankruptcy. The lower-level capitalists demanded successfully that states open up prematurely for economic reasons, laying the basis for prolonging the high rate of infection. Meanwhile, Silicon Valley sits at the center of Andrew Cuomo and Bill de Blasio's plans to reinvent New York City in the aftermath of the pandemic. The Yankee and Cowboy War, described by Carl Oglesby decades ago, is still in effect, but it has become much more complicated. The Cold War liberals have evolved into a sinister group of social engineers and have gained the upper hand by dominating social media and watching neoconservative strategies and rhetoric become utterly bankrupt. Meanwhile, the pre-neoconservative alt-right of the McCarthy era is back, harnessing anti-establishment sentiments on behalf of lower-level capitalists. Joe Biden and Kamala Harris have positioned themselves to represent the Eastern establishment, the Rockefeller faction of progressive and globalist-minded bankers, oil companies, and tech giants. They view Trump's misleadership as creating instability, mishandling the pandemic, and weakening the United States internationally in the struggle to roll back the influence of Russia and China. Kamala Harris, a prosecutor with sadistic tendencies and disregard for the rights of others who grew up amid the New Left, but rose to power within the neoconservative mass incarceration apparatus, has ascended from U.S. Senator to the position of Democratic Party's vice presidential nominee. With Joe Biden appearing quite elderly amid widespread speculation that he is senile, Harris could easily not only win the vice presidency, but become president of the United States. If Biden's condition continues to deteriorate after winning in November, Harris is likely to be taking the oath of office and becoming the first female commander-in-chief within the next 4 years. Kamala Harris fits into the trajectory of U.S. politics since World War II. She has been selected to play a particular role for a particular faction amid a situation of continued instability and division within the country. She could soon be president despite being rejected by the voters of the Democratic primary. In this light, the ugly facts about her career history, which are largely being overlooked by mainstream media, are particularly disturbing.